Hi everyone, my name is Alex Markin and I am from the Rhode Island Intensive Math Intervention Project. Welcome to what is going to be the first in a series of asynchronous learning modules focused on using acceleration to close achievement gaps in mathematics. In our work with schools and districts across the state of Rhode Island, we repeatedly hear concerns that students have experienced substantial learning loss from school closures and delays caused by COVID-19. As your school begins to examine your fall benchmark data, you may notice a decrease in the number of students who are at or above benchmark and a large increase in the number of students who are below benchmark, identified as in need of intervention or urgent intervention, compared to previous years. If your school's data follow a similar trend, it can be overwhelming to know where to begin. In the past, initial reactions to these data may have been that students need remediation, with teachers going back to the previous grade level and reteaching content that students have not yet mastered. However, COVID-19 is forcing educators to rethink this approach, as students are still being expected to master their current grade level standards despite the disruptions to instruction. As a result, spending a lot of time going over missed content from previous grades is not only inefficient, but likely not feasible with new restrictions, like fewer adults allowed in the classroom and constantly changing learning environments. Acceleration will address these two challenges, allowing educators to move forward with teaching grade level standards while also providing just-in-time supports to fill in gaps in students' knowledge as they come up in the current scope and sequence. If you're interested in learning more, you're in the right place. The purpose of this learning module is to provide a brief introduction into acceleration and clarify how acceleration differs from remediation. We are going to explain the key characteristics of acceleration and review 5 recommendations for accelerating students' learning. Future modules will dive more deeply into how to implement acceleration in your classroom, so there's going to be more learning to come. We are likely all aware of the challenges to some extent, but let's take a quick look at the research. Education disruption from COVID-19 has caused new or exacerbated existing learning gaps and inequalities. Projections suggest that major academic impacts from COVID-19, especially in math. This graph shows projections of the average academic growth trajectory by grade for math. The solid lines demonstrate typical growth, and you can see that while growth varies by academic grade, there's a general decline between the last day of school through the summer. The dashed line shows the projected trajectory under a COVID slide caused by the shutdowns. Preliminary COVID slide estimates suggest that students will return with less than 50% of the learning gains in math, with students in some grades returning nearly a full year behind where they would typically perform. This pattern was evident in the elementary grades, grades 3, 4, and 5, which are the grades targeted by the Rhode Island Math Project. Based on the students that you are working with, these trajectories may or may not have been realized. Nevertheless, missed school from closures this past spring has had major impacts on student achievement that is a call to action for all practitioners. We all know the challenges, but the question is, what is the best way to proceed to address these substantial learning gaps? A common strategy to address gaps in students' learning is remediation, meaning to teach again, when educators reteach content that students have not yet mastered before moving on to grade level content. As a result, significant time may be spent going over previously learned content. This content is often presented in isolation and is not applied to what students are currently learning. Unfortunately, there is compelling evidence that giving students simpler, previous grade level materials results in students falling further behind the grade level material. On the other hand, acceleration strategies have been shown to help students catch up with learning. Acceleration focuses on teaching only what must be learned at the precise time that it is needed. Instead of reteaching everything that a student has not yet mastered, teachers provide instruction only on the most important skills and knowledge for the specific unit that is being studied, focusing on what students must minimally know in order to adequately access the content. Since students are exposed to grade level content, materials, and assignments, it is critical that teachers support students using differentiation techniques and appropriate scaffolds so that all students can access the content. It is important to explicitly state that both remediation and acceleration are useful strategies to help students with gaps in their learning. In future modules, we will explain how remediation can complement acceleration to address skill gaps for students. So let's take a closer look at some of the characteristics of acceleration. A good place to start is to ask yourselves, do students need to know this content right now in order to continue learning the grade level subject matter? If not, keep it moving. When using acceleration strategies, prerequisite skills that students have not yet mastered are taught at the moment they are needed in the current grade level scope and sequence. To determine which skills students have not yet mastered, the teacher should be assessing students and using the results to guide their instruction. We do not want to make assumptions about what students may or may not know. We will dive into this more deeply in a future module. Let's take a quick look at this in action. In this example, a 4th grade student is struggling with adding fractions. If the teacher was using remediation, he or she may go back to the foundation of teaching fractions as numbers. The teacher may then use the 3rd grade materials and assignments to give the student extra practice with understanding the basics of fractions before moving on to the 4th grade standard. In acceleration, the teacher may use the 3rd grade model at the start of the unit to review the most important fraction concepts that the student will need to move forward with the grade level concept. The teacher will also provide scaffolding and extra problems so the student has more practice opportunities. On the previous slide, I quickly mentioned the importance of scaffolding. Since students will be working with grade level content, providing appropriate scaffolds is going to be incredibly important to ensure that students can access the curriculum. Examples of math scaffolds and supports are provided on the right. Remember that students can benefit from more concrete strategies, such as using manipulatives, before they progress to representational and abstract strategies. Additional supports include graphic organizers, partially completed multiplication tables, and targeted small groups. There also needs to be an emphasis on vocabulary development and acceleration. Students may be unfamiliar with content-specific vocabulary words, also known as Tier 3 vocabulary, which students are unlikely to encounter outside of the classroom. Teachers can use graphic organizers, such as Freyer models, to help students learn new vocabulary terms. Additional linguistic scaffolds, such as sentence frames, translations into students' first languages, and visuals can also be helpful. If you would like to increase your own knowledge around techniques to differentiate and scaffold your instruction, check out our Universal Design, Differentiation, and Scaffolding Learning module, as well as our Effective Instruction to Support Language Development Learning module, both of which are available on our project's website. Time for a quick knowledge check. One of our primary objectives for today is to explain the characteristics of acceleration. So hit pause and see if you can identify which of these characteristics are correct. Once you jot them down, press play and find out how you did. Option A. Option A is correct. In acceleration, students are exposed to the content, materials, and assignments for their current grade level, rather than spending significant time with content from previous grades. Option B is incorrect. Acceleration focuses on teaching only the most important skills and knowledge that students will need in order to minimally access the current unit being studied. Option C is correct. Since students are interacting with grade level content, they may need scaffolding and supports in order to access the content. And lastly, option D is incorrect. Traditional remediation strategies often call for starting the year by addressing gaps in students' learning for the first few weeks of school. In acceleration, foundational gaps are covered just in time or in the moment that they are needed. Here are 5 recommendations for accelerating students' learning. Number 1, to start, it's important to study the standards alongside year-long scope and sequences to understand what will be covered when, how students will apply their knowledge, and how they will show their knowledge. It's also important to identify the most critical prerequisite skills and knowledge that students will need to access the grade level content. Multilingual learners and students with disabilities may need additional supports here. Number 2, to plan your approach, educators will need to diagnose students' unfinished learning. While some pre-work was done in step 1, educators should be careful not to make assumptions about students' learning. Administering diagnostic assessments will provide the data needed to determine what content still needs to be prioritized for the students that are in front of you. Number 3, now that you have the data, you can begin to adjust your instructional materials and think about how to address students' unfinished learning. Remember, unlike remediation, these gaps should be addressed without an extended period of remedial content. Consider the pacing guidance and determine where to embed opportunities to address unfinished learning as it comes up in the scope and sequence. Number 4, for administrators, teachers may need training to diagnose and provide acceleration supports to students. If so, make sure to plan your training content, identify who will facilitate the training, and execute the training for teachers. And lastly, number 5, throughout the year, educators will need to monitor where students are mastering grade level content. Adjustments may need to be made throughout the year based on your students' data. In future modules, we will apply these recommendations as we develop year-long, unit, and lesson plans, so stay tuned to learn more. As we conclude this learning module, we want to take a moment to reiterate that remediation is not a bad strategy. Some of your students will likely require remediation supports, and that is okay. However, remediation should not be the sole focus. We want to ensure that students have exposure to grade level content, materials, and assignments whenever possible. When remediation is needed, educators should use assessments to identify the specific skills that students will need remediation for. This is not a one-size-fits-all approach where all students participate in a few weeks of math remediation. In future modules, we will discuss when to incorporate remediation strategies into your instruction for specific students. We think both strategies can complement one another in order to support students' learning. I've made a few references throughout this presentation to future learning modules. So here's where we're headed over the next 6 modules. You just completed the first module where we introduced acceleration and explained how it differed from remediation. If you're an administrator who wants to use acceleration in your school, check out our next module titled Making Acceleration a School-Wide Focus. If you're a teacher who wants to use acceleration in your classroom, skip to the 3rd module titled Developing a Year-Long Plan Using Acceleration. There will be 3 modules focused specifically for classroom teachers to comprehensively guide you through the planning process. If you are an interventionist, the teacher-focused modules will be helpful for you, but we also conclude this series with a module focused specifically on your role. As these modules become available, we will be sure to let you know, and they're also going to be uploaded to our project's website. These are my colleagues on the Rhode Island Intensive Math Intervention Project, and we look forward to supporting you. This learning module was informed from a variety of articles, books, and websites, all of which are listed here. We hope that this learning module was helpful, and thank you so much for joining us. Stay tuned as we continue this series.